Good morning and welcome to the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Friends Lecture Series. My name is Barbara Proschel and I'm president of the Friends of the Institute. I think at this point we can all agree that this is not going to be a mild winter like last year. So thank you so much for braving this very chilly morning to come join us at MIA. Today we will meet our newest curator, Dr. Max Bryant, and he'll share some of the exciting things that he has found with our decorative arts collection. But first, we'll have a note from our sponsor. This lecture is presented by the Friends of the Institute and made possible with generous support from the Mark and Mary Goff Fitterman Fund. And up on the screen, you'll note some upcoming Friends events. Our book club on Friday and Saturday, the 20th and 21st, with a discussion and a tour. On January 8th, it's a Friends members tour of the Prints and Drawings Library with ever-intriguing Prints and Drawings curator, Tom Rasher. On January 9th will be our January lecture at 11 a.m. with another amazing MIA curator, Dr. Galina Olmsted. And don't forget, we have member lecture tours as well that happen at 10 a.m. And then also please consider a donation to the Friends Bus Fund to bring school kids and others to the museum. And it's hard to read on there, but you can go to friends.artsmia.org or call our office for more information and help on that. And now I'd like to introduce Rachel McGarry, who in turn will introduce Max Bryant. Dr. Rachel McGarry is the Elizabeth Macmillan Chair of the Department of European Art and Curator of European Paintings and Works on Paper. Rachel joined MIA in 2006 and specializes in Italian Renaissance and Baroque art. You may remember that she curated the very popular exhibition, Botticelli and Renaissance Florence. Yes, Masterworks from the Uffizi. See, I see you all remember that, in partnership with the Uffizi Galleries. So Rachel earned her Master of Arts degree and PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. So please help me welcome Rachel McGarry to the stage.
Oh, I'm so happy to get such a nice introduction for my introduction. Thank you. I better put these on. This is new, these reading glasses. Okay. So it is such a pleasure for me to introduce my new brilliant colleague, Dr. Max Bryant. Max is the James Ford Bell Associate Curator of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And it's interesting to think that his appointment only began on September 30th. So this is his 11th week on the job. And it's truly astonishing what he's accomplished in this short time. So buckle up, friends. We're really in for a good ride for decorative arts and sculpture and European art. So Max earned his PhD and Master of Philosophy in the History of Art and Architecture at St. John's College, University of Cambridge. And at St. Catherine's College, University of Oxford, he earned a BA in English Language and Literature. He brings impressive curatorial experience to MIA. From 2017 to 2020, he worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and as a core member of the curatorial team, reinstalling the British Art and Design Galleries, which reopened in 2020 and are really remarkable installation. Subsequently, he served as the research fellow at the Armagh Robinson Library in Northern Ireland, and most recently, a research fellow at the Axon Johnson Center for the Study of Classical Architecture in the Faculty of Architecture and History of Art at the University of Cambridge. And he's also published widely in academic journals and exhibition catalogs. And I just want to say that the search for Max's position last spring was very competitive. We had over 83 applicants. We had 84 applicants exactly, I guess. 3 rounds of interviews, presentations, day-long campus visits. Like, it was pretty intense. And with all that said, when I first read Max's exceptional CV, I marked an A+ on the corner. Like, ooh, I'm really glad this person applied. And after our first phone interview, I was even more impressed. Max, you will see, is a true polymath with endless curiosity, extraordinary experience, an incredible eye for quality, and a steel trap mind as far as remembering every piece of Sèvres porcelain and silver he's ever seen. So, and we actually had just arranged Max's second interview last May when I was traveling to New York for an art fair. And I'll never forget settling into my 7 a.m. flight from MSP to LaGuardia and pulling out my New Yorker, and I was getting ready to read Rebecca Mead's article on the scandalous thefts at the British Museum that came out last May. And there was Max Bryant quoted on the second page of the New Yorker article. I mean, seriously, I just have to read this. It's like incredible. She starts the article about the sort of landmark acquisition of the Charles Townley collection of ancient Roman sculpture in 1805. The British Museum acquired this collection, this unrivaled collection, and Max is the world expert on Charles Townley, it turns out. So it says, according to Max Bryant, here on the second page of the article, the author of the 2017 monograph on Townley and his house, which is right here. I got his award-winning book, which is Mia's copy. You can all go read it, Mia, or buy your own because it's still available. So according to Max Bryant, the author of the 2017 monograph on Townley and his house, the collection also reflected, quote, an 18th century attitude to art that itself has become lost to modernity. And so that's really impressive. Like, what a clever way to get a job, get quoted in the New Yorker as an expert. But I really love how that quote actually gets to the heart of one of Max's scholarly interests, which is how the reception of art evolves over time, bringing to light attitudes in the 18th century or interpretations and new meanings, say, from the 1920s versus the 1960s. It's truly a fascinating subject, and we're going to learn a lot about this from Max today and through his exhibitions at MIA. So please help me give a warm welcome to Max Bryant.
So to speak on the subject of MIA's history before this audience and introduced by this curator feels doubly presumptuous. Rachel McGarry is the supreme authority on European art and its history at MIA, and you, the friends, who have of course grown up with this collection and know its history, how it unfolded in real time. But I hope our affection for MIA will allow you to tolerate some first impressions about its history from me this morning. And I want to begin by asserting the hopefully very obvious point that this is one of the premier collections of European sculpture and decorative arts in the United States. And I want to do that in a spirit of friendly rivalry, by comparing our collection with those of Cleveland and Philadelphia, two museums that are of equivalent ages and sizes. And I want to do that in 3 rounds, going through some of the canonical genres of sculpture, the Baroque, the Neoclassical, and the modern, and see how MIA compares. So let's start with the Baroque. Unquestionably the best Baroque sculpture in Cleveland is this magnificent deposition by Adam Lenckhardt, carved from a single piece of ivory. The culmination of the sculptor's career. It took him 7 years to complete. It was acquired by the great director Sherman Lee in the 60s, and it's an amazing thing to have. And in Philadelphia, a little bit more up in the air about what their best Baroque sculpture is, but I think probably this very early copy of the Algardi bronze relief in Bologna, which really compresses all the Baroque drama into an astonishingly shallow relief. A great work of bronze casting, probably not long after the original. But what do we have at MIA? Instant bolo punch by the Minneapolis Institute of Art, a bozzetto by Algardi. This is beyond world class. It's the model original for the Fountain of San Tommaso in the Vatican, one of the most exclusive areas of the Vatican even today, with the marble relief that was made after this now damaged by the elements. So even the Pope can't see this composition properly anymore. And all of the detail executed by the hand of the sculptor himself, the astonishing modeling of the back of this figure, the undercutting of the shirt as the figure in the background takes the shirt over his head. terracotta doesn't get any more theatrical and dramatic than this, which epitomizes the Baroque. So that round maybe wasn't quite fair. Let's move on to neoclassicism. And here we have the best neoclassical sculptures in Cleveland and Philadelphia. The wonderful Canova Terpsichore Lyran, which is, ticking all the boxes that you want with neoclassicism. Canova is obviously the name to have. This was exhibited at the Royal Academy in London to great acclaim. And it was a work owned by a West Indies merchant, so that means someone involved with the slave trade, but nevertheless, a magnificent thing to have. And in Philadelphia, again, a bit more up in the air, but I would say this wonderful Joseph Breck of Diana, the greatest sculpture of dogs that there's ever been, and a very underrated sculpture, I think. But compare that to what we have in Minneapolis, the Thorvaldsen of Ganymede and Jupiter, this extraordinary encounter of the mortal and the divine, the human and the non-human. It took Thorvaldsen 12 years to complete because he had to find this perfect piece of marble that was absolutely flawless in the body of Ganymede, but has its coloring all in the feathers of the eagle. And it's just an extraordinarily charged encounter that really brings to life the sort of tensions of the post-Napoleonic period in Europe. This is, in many ways, not a sculpture about perfection. It's about needing to be perfect so that you don't get your face pecked off by a giant eagle. It was in the collection of the Duke of Sutherland, so the most prestigious aristocratic collection in London. And although this doesn't obviously pertain to the intrinsic merits of it as a work of art, Stafford House was a center for the abolition movement as it continued in the Victorian period. And the African-American soprano Elizabeth Greenfield literally performed in front of the sculpture in the 1850s. So no controversy. Round two, I think, goes again to Minneapolis here. Now, let's go to modern art, and there's obviously many genres of a great modern sculpture, but Rodin is really where the game is played. And so let's compare Rodin's, and these are very strong statements by Cleveland and Philadelphia. Cleveland has his most important composition executed remarkably by the sculptor himself. The museum commissioned him to produce this cast and finish it himself. So, yes, every museum in America has this sculpture, but Cleveland has the best one, and indisputably, ticking all the boxes, perhaps without really quickening the pulse, but nevertheless, a very important thing to have. And then in Philadelphia, the entire Rodin Museum, yes, mostly posthumous casts, but still very, very comprehensive and lots of wonderful plasters and drawings. But what have we got in? How does Minneapolis respond? We've got the sculpture that Rodin himself chose to be the centerpiece, the first space in his own retrospective in 1900. This astonishing version of his own study for one of the figures in the Burghers of Calais. And there's only two in the world. The other one is in the Musée Rodin, and this is number one. And there have been no posthumous casts until the 21st century. Besides, this is just a sort of extraordinary reappropriation of his own work, in a sort of extraordinary way that anticipates the sort of Duchampian ready-made. I've got to say, surprise final knockout blow from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So, with the great quality of the collection established, I want to go through the growth of the collection, which has been the work of many donors and curators, and we'll meet some of these individuals this morning. So afterwards you can go up to the galleries, hopefully with fresh eyes after your festive luncheon. And in terms of what you can see today, the story really begins with Joseph Breck. So he's the first director. He was recruited by the trustees of Decorative Art from the Metropolitan Museum, where he'd been working in the Department of Decorative Arts that had been established by Pierpont Morgan in 1907. And it was an inspired choice, the first American curator to be trained under the great Wilhelm Valentiner in the German principles of Kulturgeschichte, or cultural history, that had been pioneered in Berlin to use a museum to not simply present masterpieces, but also tell an encyclopedic art historical narrative. In Minneapolis, Breck was known for his coldness and discipline, given the nickname of the Prussian. His directorship coincided with the First World War. And here he is at Mia, with the wonderful Moroni portrait currently on display in Gallery 342, one of his purchases, and a 16th century cassone that he bought from the great critic and dealer Robert Langton Douglas, that's no longer in the collection. And this is probably his masterpiece acquisition, this figure of Mary Magdalene in Lindenwood in Gallery 342, which over 100 years later is still our most important 15th century sculpture. Breck acquired it, covered in later polychromy and gilding, at this German school from the Paris firm of Marx Frère. In a testament to Breck's judgment in 2011, it was attributed finally by a scholar at the University of Leipzig to the Dutch sculptor Nicholas Gerhardt, arguably the greatest sculptor of the early Renaissance north of the Alps. And I'm going to read what Breck wrote in the bulletin. The Met used to produce, the Mia used to produce a bulletin of describing acquisitions. And what Breck wrote may make you roll your eyes a little bit, but I'm going to read it anyway. Here we have the work of one who has looked into the human heart. Beneath the pattern of line and area is a living woman. Not your idea, perhaps, of a saint, nor mine. Rather, of a pretty woman, dainty in her ways, coquetting with religion, nevertheless very real. Our artist may never have seen a saint, but, no doubt, he saw many a maid like this in his parish church. If we are not raised to spiritual heights by his conception of sainted character, we are delighted by his humanity. So that was Breck on this piece before anyone knew it was Gerhardt. Now, close behind as an acquisition is this Giovanni della Robbia figure of abundance, now in Gallery 332, which is also from Robert Langton Douglas. The model is represented in a lot of collections, but this is still the best one in terms of the completeness of its glazing. And Breck had a mission to fill the big spaces of the new museum. But this large Madonna in 340 that he got from the Seligman in New York shows how he still acquired works that have stood the test of time. At the great sale in New York of Renaissance decorative arts from the Palazzo Davanzati in Florence, Breck avoided the many spurious works and acquired one of the best preserved 15th century cassone to survive, now in Gallery 343, decorated in painted gesso. At the same sale, he acquired a group of Italian glass from which these two examples are taken, now in Gallery 332. Breck's main focus at Mia was the creation of period rooms. But for Breck in the 1910s, the term period room does not mean what it does today. The acquisition of complete interiors for more or less accurate reinstallation was not yet a goal for curators. Rather, period rooms meant ensembles of closely contemporary paintings and decorative arts. The result, presented against bare walls, to my eyes at least, always looks so fresh and modern in old gallery photography. Breck wrote with these that he was, quote, striving to arrange our exhibits so that they will be in logical and beautiful relation one to the other and form a harmonious ensemble which in itself will be a work of art. Breck left Mia to return to the Met, and he was to die not long after. In 1933, he was traveling in Switzerland to obtain flowers for the gardens of the cloisters, the Met's new medieval outpost, with the flower choice to be determined by those depicted in medieval art. On one such specimen-finding expedition, he had a heart attack and died. You know a curator was one of the greatest to ever do it when they die in the most art historically appropriate circumstances. It's like going into Museum Valhalla. Breck entered Museum Valhalla at the age of only 48. Now, the next figure that I want to discuss is Mia's longest-serving director, Russell Plimpton, who worked under Breck at the Met. Plimpton, unlike Breck, hadn't studied art history, but majored in finance. And it might be a little hard to believe from these photos of him, but he was, by all accounts at the time, quote, Plimpton, by all accounts at the time, quote, radiated warmth and charm. On the right, he is flanked by the great donor Bruce Dayton and his successor as director, Richard Dicky Davis. In the 1920s, Plimpton turned Breck's period rooms closer to the spaces that we would recognize today. He installed this, I'm afraid, rather dubious paneling that had been acquired from the all-round adventurer Arthur Vernet. Vernet also shot the elephants in New York's Natural History Museum. It is, however, the earliest English interior and the earliest surviving quote-unquote historic interior of any kind in an American museum, which makes it a major landmark. But these delightful wax figures now on view in Gallery 322 convey something of the spirit of the period room for Plimpton. The ensemble is what matters, and we are very close to the dioramas of natural history museums that had been pioneered earlier in the century in the Midwest by taxidermist Carl Akeley in Milwaukee and Chicago. Plimpton acquired these from the interior decorators Maison Jassen in Paris. As much as curators of this generation valued period rooms, they probably would be a bit surprised to find them displayed as works of art in their own right, as museums have tended to do since the 1980s, as historic interiors. They were really intended as backdrops, a context in which their often dubious provenance and authenticity are less at issue. Our small but distinguished collection of antiquities also owes a lot to Plimpton. I love this portrait of a very fashionable older woman, now in 241. It was probably found as part of the excavations of Joachim Murat around Naples. Plimpton acquired it from Joseph Breck in New York, a dealer who kept antiquities on Plimpton's radar by soliciting gifts for him from collectors, such as this bronze now on display in 317 that was once in the famous 19th century collection in Rome of Gregoire Stroganov. Plimpton's overall acquisitions in European decorative arts and sculpture were relatively undistinguished compared to those of Breck, and certainly compared to what Wilhelm Valentina was achieving as director in Detroit during the same decades. But in his 30 years in the role, that signature Plimpton warmth and charm helped to cultivate some especially brilliant donors. Ella Martin is a particularly remarkable example. A widow, she wanted to give a gift of late 17th century tapestries that she had seen in New York to the museum in memory of her husband. Unsentimental Breck talked her out of giving something from such a hopelessly low era for the medium, but encouraged her enthusiasm for tapestry. Plimpton developed this relationship, and aside from the gifts of tapestry that Martin gave, she also served as an advisor and a scout for the museum, particularly with the great firm of French & Company. I'd love to research more about the extent of Martin's influence on the shape of the tapestry collection, because the result is one of the most important in any American museum. The other great donor of the Plimpton era was the founder of General Mills, James Ford Bell. His interest in English silver was only part of a wider fascination with globalization and trade that's manifested in the James Ford Bell Library at the university, well worth a visit. No sphere of the decorative arts tells the story of the global impact of European trade than silver does. For example, John Locke's stabilization of the English currency directly affected the material used to make this tankard, which had to be executed to an unprecedented degree of purity, now on display in 354. Huguenot refugees in London brought innovative forms of ornament, exemplified by these casters by Isaac Liger, now on view in 350, the Silver Gallery. But at this point in my talk, you might be wondering, where are all those sculptural masterpieces I showed you at the beginning? It's time to introduce Richard Dicky Davis, who you may have heard about for his deaccessioning program in the late 1950s. Davis is often cast as a villain, a name that is used to scare young curators into behaving responsibly. And as much as everything in this talk is really Rachel's subject, Dicky Davis is really, really Rachel's subject. Here's the Harvard-educated Davis, looking extremely excited to be leaving the directorship of the Cranbrook Academy of Art and enlisting in the US Naval Reserves, where he distinguished himself as a monuments man in Japan. At MIA, Davis worked under Plimpton, gradually gaining apparently complete influence over the trustees. And as director from 1956, he undertook a policy of selling anything he didn't like in order to fund acquisitions. Most famously, this included lots of American paintings, but also most of the European decorative arts as well. Davis was a subscriber to the MoMA-authorized teleology of art history towards post-impressionism and modernism, and his ideal museum object was probably something like this: Brancusi's Golden Bird, which will soon return to view in Gallery 377 in the new year. Davis bought this from Knoedler in New York, and it was a brilliant acquisition. In 1990, the Art Institute of Chicago bought to enormous fanfare Brancusi's other edition of the Golden Bird, completely identical. At the time, the Art Institute claimed that their golden bird was the one that was photographed by the sculptor in this iconic photograph, and the one that was the subject of a famous poem by Mina Loy, published in The Dial in 1922. Both of these claims have been separately disproved by scholars, and the current literature has shown that our version in Minneapolis is the golden bird which claims these honors. Soon to go on display in Gallery 310 in the new year is this early Lenckhardt ivory that Davis bought from the Rosenberg and Stiebel Gallery in New York. It comes at the opposite end of Lenckardt's career from the Cleveland example that I showed earlier, which was acquired many years later. But that doesn't mean it's any less powerful. Some forms of sculpture are tests of physical prowess as much as of the imagination, and microscopically detailed ivory carving is one. Lenckhardt, when he made this, was in peak condition. The flab, chest hair, and veins are virtuoso effects from a sculptor at the beginning of his career and arguably at the height of his powers. Davis single-handedly put our medieval collection on the map with this acquisition currently on view in Gallery 340 that he bought from Wildenstein and Company in New York. It represents the most opulent era of French Gothic, that of St. Louis and the Sainte-Chapelle, part of an altar front whose other two securely associated elements are in the Cluny Museum in Paris. In this country, it's only really comparable to the deposition scene at the center of Pierpont Morgan's Tabernacle of Chèvres. While Mears has lost its backdrop, the figures are larger and retain their enamel eyes. Davis's one arguable L was his first big acquisition of 1959, which was sold to him as the original bronze Geistkämpfer made for the University of Church of Kiel by the great German expressionist sculptor Ernst Barlach. In fact, this is a cast made when the original was being reassembled in Berlin after the Second World War. However, there are various convoluted factors that mitigate in Davis's favor here, and it's still an incredibly audacious acquisition for a museum at the time. Davis acquired the Algardi bozzetto from the dealer Adolf Lervy in Los Angeles later that year. J. Paul Getty must only have taken his eye off the ball because he was focused on the antiquities destined for the villa. Valentina had been consulting director for the art collection of the Los Angeles Museum, later LACMA, but had left by 1959. So there was a window of time in Los Angeles where Los Angeles was a bad place to be selling a Baroque masterpiece. But how Davis managed to pull off this coup is a story I'm desperate to research. The Rodin that we saw earlier was an acquisition that came from a local widow who gave it in memory of her husband. However, all signs indicate that this is another case where Davis exercised his usual influence over donors, since Fine Arts Associates in New York shipped the sculpture straight to the museum. Finally, Davis acquired contemporary works, and all of these will soon be on view in Gallery 376 in the new year. They came from 3 different galleries, but were all part of a traveling show whose first stop was Minneapolis. And when I say contemporary, I don't mean it in the sense that we now often use it in art history for anything in the last 30 years or so. Some of these sculptures were literally made the previous year. Consagra remains a bafflingly underrated figure in this country. Paolozzi and Pomodoro have gone on to extremely eminent and widely collected careers. The Paolozzi, in particular, has a quality that anticipates arte povera in its appropriation of the discarded elements of the bronze casting process. Davis is understandably a controversial figure for what he deaccessioned. Anyone who appreciates the decorative arts has to deplore the highbrow philistinism of expelling jewelry, costume, and other media from the purview of the museum. But in terms of fine art sculpture at least, we have to judge him also by what he spent the money on. Davis's dictatorship was most absolute during the years 1957, 58, and the beginning of 59. For those 2.5 years, in the field of fine art sculpture, every pass was completed, every shot was on target, Davis could not miss. Certainly, he overspent, but I cannot think of an American institution making a comparable run of such absolutely god-level acquisitions in such a short time. In 1959, the trustees appointed a president to supervise Davis, deciding Deciding that it was better to burn out than to fade away, he resigned and never again held an institutional role at a museum until his death a quarter century later. But this whole extraordinary story is not mine to tell, and besides, there was better to come. Because for European art historians, the Minneapolis Institute of Art is synonymous with one name, Anthony Tony Clark, who after an interregnum was Davis's successor. This is because, while a visit to the museum itself might remain an obscure object of desire for most Europeans, Clark's achievement was also manifested in scholarship, specifically the catalogue raisonné of Pompeo Bertoni, an essential companion to the aristocratic collections of Britain and Italy. It is also the defining work of rehabilitation for the Settecento, the 18th century era in Italian art, that had been widely dismissed until Clark. The fact that some of the greatest scholarship about 18th century Rome was produced in snowy Minneapolis is one of the most delightful incongruities of art historiography. Clark didn't have Davis's budget to spend for obvious reasons, but he summered in Rome and he frequented the smaller dealers there that were off the radar of other museums, and he got incredible bargains. Clark's first really sensational decorative arts acquisition is now in view in Gallery 308. Nominally a font for holy water, the design develops the Baroque structure in an unholy way to tremble, shake, and surge into every kind of effect that silver can produce. Nothing like this had been seen in an American museum in 1963. It doesn't fit into an encyclopedic program like that of Breck, being too much of an astonishing prodigy. It doesn't fit into the teleological one of Davis, its delights, all ones that repudiate the principles of modern design. And I'll just show you the Met 3 decades later, trying to get something similar, with lots of lapis and a wonderful silver relief. And you know they spent a lot of money on it because it's from the Weitzman Fund, but none of the thrilling structural instability of Mia's example. And I'll just juxtapose, a rather cruel juxtaposition perhaps. I won't comment directly on this. But Clark got this from an obscure gallery called Sestieri in Rome that he would return to for many other expositions. Now on view in Gallery 310, I think this incredibly important early sculptural table. At a time when American museums were all trying to acquire British Palladian furniture, Clark acquired the type of Roman example that British designers like William Kent were actually imitating. I couldn't resist showing you also this comparison with a set of furniture at the Palazzo Chigi Auricia, which has been proven to have been designed by no less a figure than Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the greatest sculptor of the Baroque. Needless to say, we are researching this connection. Clark sometimes did need to spend to get a Settecento masterpiece. Now on view in Gallery 307 is the first work of Piranesi furniture to enter a museum collection anywhere, which Clark acquired at Colnaghi. This was made for the apartments of the nephew of Pope Clement XIII Rezzonico in the Palazzo del Quirinale. The fertility of Piranesi's imagination is on full display with the creation of these chimera table legs that seem ready to hop around the room and take flight. We have this modern surface of marble over concrete with a wonderful bronze spiral around the edge. The Rijksmuseum later acquired the pair, and they have a very plain piece of wood painted as marble as their surface. Ours was commissioned by the greatest living scholar of Italian decorative arts, Alvar González Palacios, before Clark acquired it. And I'm grateful that our surface exhibits a sophisticated panache that I don't think any museum would be bold enough to attempt today. Clark's purchase of a major Thorvaldsen at Wildenstein in New York long predated the rediscovery of the Danish sculptor, whose reputation had been limited by the confinement of so many of his most important works to his dedicated museum in Copenhagen. And now, of course, I think by most people's estimates, Thorvaldsen is a much more interesting sculptor than Canova, but nobody thought that at the time. Now on display in the new installation in Gallery 322 is this astonishingly opulent inkstand that also doubles as an architectural model for the vision of Pope Pius VI Braschi for the erection of an obelisk on the Quirinale in Rome. Clark acquired it from a dealer Apolloni in Rome, who would continue to be a source for the museum. We don't know who commissioned it or why, because there's no inscription. but I can't help wondering if the Pope had it made for himself. Certainly, its travelling case would have come in useful, as following his deposition, the Pope was shunted around city after city by Napoleon. Finally, just to show that Clark did not only acquire works made in Rome, here's the famous Veiled Lady in Gallery 357, made in Victorian London, that Clark got from Charles Jourdain, a small London dealer. I don't think Clark would have had any idea of how much the public would embrace this work. And finally, this Clésanger from Shepherd Gallery in New York. Rachel has recently positioned this in 321 next to the big Corot from James J. Hill's collection, a pairing that is so good that I wonder if Clark didn't buy it for this very purpose. Clésanger, once a carver for Thorvaldsen and a virtuoso in marble, perfectly captures Clark's very refined commitment to decadence and the disreputable parts of art history. His sculpture and decorative arts acquisitions were consistently seductive and surprising, as well as bargains for the acquisitions budget. Clark left Mia following tensions with the staff and unsuited to the directorship when the museum's principal business was the completion of the Tanguay wing. He went to the Met in New York and only remained for a short time due to conflict with the director. With the arrival last year of his notebooks at the Getty, including his meticulous diaries, I am hopeful that we will discover much more about his work at Mia, and that in the not-too-distant future, Tony Clark will come to be seen as an icon of Minneapolis on the level of Prince and Bob Dylan. Possibly, I don't think it's that implausible. I think it could happen. It could happen. Let's give it a few years. Possibly with the Tanguay wing complete, the trustees might have considered bringing Clark back. It would not have been unprecedented. Francis Henry Taylor returned to the directorship of the Wadsworth Athenaeum for a distinguished second act, having left for the Met under similar circumstances. But it was not to be. Anthony Clark entered Museum Valhalla in the gardens of the Villa Doria Pamphili, west of Rome, suffering a heart attack at age 52 while jogging to the Arch of the Four Winds. Clark's protege and successor was a young woman from Texas, Maribel Parsons, who both continued his vision and struck out in some brilliant new directions. And coincidentally, Parsons was hired into her last institutional role in 2013 at the San Antonio Museum by none other than Mia's current director, Katie Luber. Now on view in Gallery 308 is this desk that Parsons acquired through one of Clark's contacts, Apolloni in Rome, venturing into the Venetian rather than the Roman Settecento. But Parsons' best European acquisitions, I think, were in 19th century sculpture. This Carpeau, on view in Gallery 321, that she bought at Cyril Humphreys in London, is the original plaster. The ones in the Orsay and the Petit Palais, their plasters are copies of this one. And the Alfred Gilbert in Gallery 310 was acquired from Heim Gallery in London, when the taste for Victorian art was at a nadir. But even within a few years, its value will have multiplied many times. During the Parsons years, the European decorative arts began to be enormously enriched by the work of donors Carolyn and Franklin Groves, perhaps modelling themselves on the power couple of Jane and Charles Weitzman, whose rooms were being installed at the Met from the late 70s. The Groveses focused on a huge gap in Mia's collection, French decorative arts of the 18th century. Always the most expensive area, Mia had avoided it, but the Groves bought exclusively at auction, so even though they were shopping at the top of the market, I'm sure they got incredible bargains. And it wasn't easy to shop at auction in those days because Sotheby's and Christie's had only just started advertising to private buyers and not just dealers. Illustrated here, they got the birds from Sotheby's in Monaco, the clock at Christie's in New York, and the desk at Christie's in London, so you can see they did a lot of traveling too. Their donations essentially dominate Gallery 314, where all these works can be found today. In noticing a specific gap in the collection and becoming complete masters of it, Carolyn and Franklin Groves took on a huge challenge in the spirit of Ella Martin. It was heroic work, and I wanted to salute their contributions to the museum. Finally, the longest serving and still active of all the contributors that I'll be discussing today, you, the Friends of the Institute, in your inaugural year of 1922, for your first ever gift to the museum, you acquired a group of Florentine decorative arts for a total of $354.12, you acquired a group of 15th century furniture. And this chair from the group, and they were all acquired from the Florentine dealer and painter, Federico Peduli. Is it 15th century? No. Is it 17th century? Possibly. Is it 19th century? More probably. But is it a most cherished part of this museum that we value and love to this day? Absolutely, 100%. And one of the pieces, all of this is still, incidentally, in the collection of the museum, including the brocatelle that is used as a backdrop to the chair there, and the salver. So it's all still here. Nobody deaccessioned this, and it all is in pretty good condition. The one piece that's on display from this group is this wonderful cassone, one of my absolute favorite objects in the whole collection, inlaid with intarsia, now on display in 330 in the Central Baroque Gallery, which was acquired from Leopoldo Aretini in Florence. The intarsia patterns suggest an influence from Islamic carpet design that I look forward to researching. And so this was the first ever Friends gift to the museum. And more recently, they've continued. And we've got 3 more from the 90s that are all currently on display. We've got in 1996, you gave the Thomas Hope table that's now on view in 322 from Blairman's in London. This early 17th century Italian reverse cassetta frame, painted with its spandrel painted to look like marble. And it's one of those uncannily perfect pairings of painting and frame that is the specialty of Paul Mitchell, the London frame dealer, now on view in Gallery 313. And then finally, the Bavarian nativity scene in 310, which has recently got on view for the holidays. I have to say, I've looked through the donations since then for further gifts in the field of European sculpture and decorative arts. I've searched in vain, I'm afraid to say. No further gifts since the Hope table in 1996. Maybe I've made a mistake on that. Someone in the Q&A will correct me. I think it is time now for questions. I'm sorry if I've overlooked something there. But thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And happy holidays.